Blade on the Line, Book 2, The Good Samaritan, Chapter 1. A month later, Monterrey, Mexico. This is ridiculous. Sending everyone over there to handle one problem. Nate threw his hands in the air to protest Marina. The Latino woman stood there with her lips twisted as she glared at Nathaniel. I don't care what you think, Nathaniel, this is my decision. She pursed her dark lips with an attitude. Nate glared at her with a menacing look. You did not start this group, nor did you fund it. Last I looked, I paid you to be my gunman and to pull a trigger, not to tell me what I need to do. Marina took a moment to calm down her attitude as well as her voice. Her arms unfolding from her chest. A sleeveless top hung loosely off her slim body and hung beside her gray slacks. She was dressed like a businesswoman, but Nate was dressed like an off-duty soldier. Nate stood there with black BDUs, a black undershirt, an open button-down short-sleeve shirt. The top shirt was baggy enough to conceal his weapon that was tucked nicely on his hip holster. I have Vesper Violet, whatever she calls herself these days, and Derek is out there already. I just want you to be close by in case something goes wrong. I need William to know we are backing him in acquiring that company. Unlike his brother, that congressman, William Green knows what he is doing. He washes my father's money, and if he can get us the weapons we need, and out to our people, the better. It took some convincing after his brother, that congressman, was killed, but my father was successful. Now, it is our job to protect him as well as aid him in any way or means necessary, part of my father's big plans with the CIA. You know this already. Nate placed his hands on his hips and watched her ramble on as if it was a business meeting. He was silent the whole time. I could have sworn you were filled in on all this already. Or am I mistaken? Marina cocked her head to the side and lifted a brow. What about the others? Kevin. Coho. JJ. He asked a bit sarcastically as his hazel eyes glared over to Marina. If she was going to get cocky, so was he. Why must you always be so stubborn and bullheaded? Marina took a deep breath through her nose before continuing. Coho is in Africa working with his people and getting a stronghold there. Kevin is securing our new trade routes out of prying eyes of the government, and JJ, that little Cajun, is off doing other things for me. Marina kept her stance strong and her eyes fixed on Nate. Because it is ridiculous to waste all this manpower when one of them could have done the job right the first time. Nate was not afraid to talk back to her, or anyone for that matter. You know, I see why they kicked you out the military now. Marina blurted out, taking a step towards him. She grew up in a cartel family and was not afraid of him. You are a great soldier and tactician, but you are stubborn and question me too much. If you don't like a mission, you won't do it, and you are lucky I am not as harsh on you as I am with the others. The only reason I haven't kicked you out, or have you killed for that matter, is because of your skill set. Out of all of my devils, you are the most qualified and skilled. That is because you know I'm right, and you want me to go and clean up your mess. Nate knew Marina normally would snap if someone would give her this much trouble, but her devils were Hurley, and Nate was the cream of the crop. They were the backbone to her plans, and she needed them to not only all be on the same page, but also compliant. Nate knew she was the type of person to make others see her point of view and agree with them. The key to her manipulation was to have it to where the person thought it was their idea in the first place, when all along it was Marina's idea. Nate was one for perfection. A true soldier who believed in getting the job done right the first time, and she was playing to that. Nate knew all this, as he was a great judge of character. He had a knack for studying and guessing others' next move. You know, Marina, sometimes I wonder how you stayed afloat this long. He shook his head a bit. Why? 'Cause I'm a woman. Marina was about to pounce. Nate knew she did not like being underestimated because she was a woman in a man's business. No, I could care less if you were a woman or a man. If someone can do the job right, then who cares what gender they are? My whole thing is, it is just stupid to put all your eggs in one basket. Nate explained. I will go out there. I could use the break. He cut the argument short, before she could start back up with her speeches. Nate knew she could go on for days, something she took after her father with, but Nate was not one to hear it or talk much. Nathaniel was more of a man of action than words. For a man of few words, you sure had a lot to say. Marina narrowed her eyes at him, trying not to let him get under her skin. Nate turned to exit the room as Marina rambled on towards him about God knows what. He didn't feel like hearing any more of it as he slammed the door behind him. Texas. JJ, our Cajun, was sent off to the States to handle a few things for the cartel. The first was to locate the ones who informed the cartel of their missing money. Second, he was to find who was taking the money and handle it. It had been about 5 years since the death of Sean, and JJ was still not any closer to bringing the main reason for it to an end. JJ did, however, find out that Congressman Green was in bed with the cartel. The cartel helped put him in office, and in return the congressman introduced them to his brother, William Green. William Green had a few banks which helped them hold and wash their money, a very important asset to the cartel. Mr. Alvarez wanted Marina to send a few of her devils to help not only protect William, but also to monitor Mr. Green. William was also getting close to getting his hands on a company that produced weapons and software for the military. William made a deal with the cartel's other business partners, a rebel group from the Russian-Ukrainian area. The amount of findings Kevin had on these people were outstanding, and JJ knew it was only time before he would bring down this little crime ring. So, the Cajun bided his time, and did what he was told. The intricate web was finally coming into view. The bodyguard who shot Sean worked for the congressman, as told by Kevin. The congressman who also worked with the cartel. JJ didn't care for the rebel group or any of the others. He wanted the Alvarez family. They were the cause of this all, and JJ would not rest till they were all dead or in jail, like Kevin promised him. JJ made his way towards Houston, Texas, where a few of the associates of the cartel operated. He was to meet them at a place just outside the city. Night fell as JJ drove his large truck out to the rendezvous spot. Parking behind the two other vehicles, JJ killed the engine. The night air was cool as it was now spring, so JJ sported a light camo jacket covering up the black New Orleans Saints t-shirt underneath. Marina loved JJ. He looked like a regular redneck, and no one suspected him of working with a major crime family. JJ placed his loaded handgun on the inside of the jacket before hopping out the truck. The Cajun made his way in front of the two cars. Headlights lit up the two males waiting for JJ. The two men waiting to meet JJ were both Mexican in nationality. One wore a suit and the other sported street clothes. JJ walked up and stood in front of the headlights, watching them. "Marina sent you?" the one in the suit asked. JJ nodded slightly to indicate yes. The street-looking one let out a chuckle. "Aw man, you look like one of those country boys." He was clearly a street thug, being how he carried himself. Wisecrack jokes, tattooed neck and face, and the stupid smile lowered his IQ even more. The suited man was more reserved and looked a bit more professional. JJ ignored the thug and set his attention on the other. A couple shipments of cash had been turning up a bit short. Nothing too major, but it has become a pattern. Over the course of a few months, the total of missing cash has increased. Over 200,000. We believe it is the two individuals taking the money to the bank itself. The suited man continued to inform JJ, while the other just kept a smug grin on his face. The thug kept making remarks about JJ, and the Cajun did his best to ignore him and focus on the suited male. It didn't help that JJ's own paranoid voices began to ramble, mixing with the other males. A few drops of rain fell and beaded off JJ's hat, which reminded him of the same rain where he made his first kill. Most of the time, JJ had his voices and anger under control, but this rain and situation triggered a flashback. The flashback of that night when he committed his first crime. The domino effect that took JJ to his downward spiral into madness. Those emotions mixed with the taunting of the male, pushed JJ over the edge. The male in the suit slowly reached in his jacket pocket, while the thug slipped his hand in his own pocket. JJ lost it. Thunder clapped, and JJ quickly grabbed his gun and shot the thug and the suited man. The suit man fell dead, clutching the paper he was going to retrieve, which JJ mistaken for a gun in his paranoia. Unlucky for JJ, the thug was still alive and crying out, "What is wrong with you?" He was giving you the whereabouts of the two. The thug paused to cough up the crimson liquid. The blood ran down his mouth and spilled on the now wet dirt under him. Rain started to pour down on the three of them, and the thunder pulled JJ out of his trance. He lowered his gun and stared at the other man he killed. JJ knew he had made a mistake, but he could care less at this point. Unlike the old JJ, who paused when deciding to pull the trigger, he had evolved into this. He walked over and bent down to grab the blood-stained paper. Clutching it in his hand, JJ then walked back to shoot the thug in the head. All the while, the Cajun keeping his sight on the horizon. Making his way to his truck, JJ placed his gun back in his jacket. JJ did not unfold the paper until he restarted his truck. He then put the address in his phone and drove back to the highway. JJ wasted no time in completing his job. He pulled up across from the driveway that the GPS led him to. JJ sat for a moment and watched as the rain poured down, beating the house. It was the perfect cover for his crimes. His voices were screaming at him, and JJ shushed them as he hopped out of his truck. The Cajun walked swiftly to the house, covered by darkness. Taking out his gun, he knocked on the door. JJ waited and listened to the shuffling in the house as his hand gripped the handgun. A male cracked the door open, and he looked half out of it. JJ used his shoulder to slam into the door, knocking the man back on his backside. JJ had his gun raised and pointed straight at the man's face. "Norman, where's the money?" he asked in a stern voice. I don't have it." JJ pointed the gun at the man's knee and fired. The outside storm covered the noise. The man screamed in pain as he held his leg. Okay. It's in the bedroom." Without hesitation, JJ shot the man in the head and walked over his body. The Cajun kept his eyes peeled as he walked through the small house. He reached a door and kicked it in. A woman screamed and fell off the bed. "Hands! Let me see your hands. Now!" JJ yelled, and the woman slowly showed her hands. "Where's the money?" he growled. "It's in the closet." She pointed with her fingers. JJ shuffled closer to the closet and peeked inside. There was a duffel bag on top of a mountain of clothes. He slowly unzipped the bag to reveal the cash. JJ then replaced his other hand on the gun and walked over to the crying woman. With his seared conscience, JJ put one in her head before walking out. The cartel was ruthless, and JJ had to carry out orders. JJ called one of the men in the area to come and retrieve the money before heading back out to his truck. This was one of his easier missions. It was in and out. Messy, but quick to finish. No remorse, no conscience, just the loss of a good man's intentions. The results of that night didn't hit Johnny till he was alone and quiet on the highway. The flashbacks of that night and the night of seeing his brother was too much. He quickly pulled over and sobbed a bit. "What have I become?" He reached in his pocket and dialed that pastor's number. "Preacher, it's JJ. I have messed up bad, and I don't know what to do." He began to explain everything that had happened since Sean's death. The preacher sat and listened to the almost sobbing man. "I don't think God will forgive me. I am in too deep and done too much." JJ sniffed as he got all his frustrations out. "Jonathan, Jesus died on the cross for our sins. No matter what you have done, all you must do is ask for forgiveness and turn away from it. Give up that life and let God deal with this. Vengeance is his." The preacher tried to talk JJ out of his mission. "I know too much, and I have to bring these people down." JJ leaned his head against the steering wheel. "There are ways. Go to the police, you may go to jail, but no more blood will be on your hands." There was a point in that prodigal son's life when he said enough was enough. "Don't wait till it's too late and you are in the pig pen." JJ the preacher kept trying to convince him, but JJ wouldn't have it. "Just do me a favor, can you check in on my mom?" The preacher agreed, and JJ gave him her information. JJ then thanked the preacher and hung up quickly. The Cajun took a deep breath as he wiped the tear-stained cheeks. He needed to get his head back in the game, or he would lose it. Chapter 2. The next day, across town, the light shone through the office window, lighting up Mr. Welsh's gold plaque. The engraved lettering glimmered and reflected on the wall, while behind it Mr. Welsh sat. He tapped his fountain pen on the glass desk as he read the stack of papers in front of him, his mouth silently forming the words as his eyes scanned the paper. A knock at the door broke the silence. A young chipper blonde poked her head through the thick wooden door. "Hi, Mr. Welsh. I'll be right up with your coffee, sir," she said with a smile. Without looking up from his papers, he replied to her bubbly statement. "Yes, thank you, Miss Lizzie." She smiled and nodded, closing the door behind her, her shoulder-length hair and ruffled pink skirt bouncing as she walked down the hall. The door creaked open again, slowly revealing a taller, slim woman. This woman was very different from the chipper secretary. Her long dark hair was pulled back into a ponytail that brushed against her waist. Her motions were silent and effortless as she entered the room. Her olive skin, along with her all-black attire, made her stand out against the white-colored walls of the office. She slowly grabbed the door and clicked the lock. The clicking noise of the handle made Mr. Welsh look up. "What are you doing here?" he asked bluntly with a touch of anger. The woman didn't answer. She slowly walked closer to the front of his desk. Her knee-length leather boots looked as if they were floating across the white carpet. "Look, I told you to never contact me here. Better yet, never contact me at all. I don't understand. You people are supposed to be intelligent, and you are not too smart, nor can you comprehend words." The woman smiled as she unzipped her waist-length leather jacket. "My name is Vespa, and I will be conducting business with you today." When it was unzipped all the way, she let go of the zipper and reached inside it. Mr. Welsh stared at her for a moment, trying to figure out what she was doing. His forehead wrinkled, and his brows creased with frustration. Questions filled his head. Who was this woman? And what in the hell was she doing? Mr. Welsh grew impatient, and it showed on his face. He stood up from his chair, standing eye level with her. "Look, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Mr. Welsh reached for his phone. Vespa smiled an evil grin while pulling her hand from her jacket. The 6-inch silver blade in her hand caught the sunlight a bit, making the glint shine on his brown eyes. "What in the—" But before he could finish his sentence, the assassin threw the small silver dagger. It left her hand and sped through the air with precise aim. The dagger traveled with such force that it landed hilt deep into Mr. Welsh's forehead. His hand slowly let the phone drop as his body collapsed into the large chair. It wheeled a bit from the force of his limp body, and came to a stop as it hit the large window behind him. Being 5 stories up, no one would bother to notice the dead man slumped in the chair. Vespa quickly put on her black leather gloves as she walked around the other side of the desk. She began opening drawers and tossing things out of them. Whatever she was looking for was not here. She cursed under her breath as she walked over towards the body. "Too bad for you, Mr. Welsh. This was just all business." She smiled and reached for the silver knife. The hilt had a wasp engraved into it with black paint inside to make it stand out. Her long fingers gripped the hilt and pulled it out of his skull. She wiped his blood off the knife onto his pants, the blood soaking into his black suit pants. "Ciao capo," she whispered as she placed the knife back in her jacket. She then turned and made her way out his office, zipping her jacket while she walked. The lively blonde made her way back to her boss's office, her hands filled with files and other papers, along with Mr. Welsh's coffee. She reached the large door and knocked before she entered. She was looking down at the pile in her hands as she walked in. "Now, Mr. Welsh, I know it's a lot," but she started and then looked up. Her face went pale when she saw her boss. Lizzie then let out a blood-curdling scream and flung the papers along with the coffee. The brown liquid stained the floor, and papers floated around as she ran out the office, still screaming. Across town, the TV blared the news inside the large office. A small group watched with sorrowful faces. Welsh Incorporated, the country's leading computer software company, has suffered a great loss today. the company that produces software for the military, along with other medical facilities around the world, mourns the loss of the founder and CEO of the company, John Welsh. Please stay tuned until after the break for more on this story. The red-haired reporter restacked her papers as the station cut to a commercial. An older gentleman turned the TV off, his face full of sorrow. He turned to the others that gathered in the room. The board members had to meet at the Welsh's estate due to the murder. The police shut down almost the whole building due to the incident. We need to tell Paige. The man spoke, cutting through the silence. The others agreed by shaking their heads. He beckoned one of the guards. The large dark-skinned man that stood at the door walked swiftly towards him. James, retrieve Ms. Welsh from class, but do not tell her anything. I need to be the one who does it. The larger man shook his head. The older man placed his hand over his mouth, thinking. Yes, Mr. Glass. James nodded and swiftly did as he was commanded. Mitch, what are we to do? Paige is not nearly ready to take over this company. Another gentleman asked. Mitch waited for the bodyguard to exit before he turned and answered. We will help her, as we did her father when he first started this company. She is next in line for it, and I believe she has great potential. Mitch sat on the couch running his hands through his salt and pepper hair. The others gathered around him bickering amongst themselves. The company was on the brink of going under at this point. The members began to become panicky, as each one began to talk and whisper and mumble to each other and themselves. Hey, let's not lose our focus here. Out of everyone in this room, John was my closest friend. Please, he raised his hand for them to be quiet. Just stop arguing, okay? He lowered his hand on his knee, shaking it up and down out of anxiety. Mitch tried to figure out how he was going to break the news to John's daughter. The small group quieted down, but panic still shone on their faces. One member brought Mitch a drink to calm him. Mitch, John was also my friend. I am only trying to look out for his legacy. I would hate for the company he worked so hard to build to go under. The bald man handed Mitch the drink. Mitch looked up from the floor and took it slowly. The ice and amber liquid shook in his hand as he sipped from it. I understand that. But we need to keep our heads, especially around Paige, and above all, the press. Mitch took another sip and then sat the glass down. John Welsh had a reason. He wanted only his daughter, Paige, to take over the company. He had trusted few people and Paige was one of them. John Welsh was a multi-million-dollar businessman. He was head owner and CEO of the computer software and weapons manufacturing company known as Welsh Incorporated. Many other companies were interested in a merger with Welsh, but he declined. He'd been afraid to merge with anyone because of his lack of trust in others. Mr. Welsh was afraid they would want to take his software and sell it for terrorist use or another bad purpose. Paige Welsh was almost 24, and next in line to run Welsh Incorporated. She was a very smart and free-spirited person. She always had a smile on her face, even when it was hard being the daughter of a very wealthy man. She was also strong-willed and often got what she wanted. She was loved and admired by everyone, and she also had their respect. Paige's mother had passed away when she was only 4, in a fatal car accident, so it was just her and her father now. Mr. Welsh had intended for his daughter to take over. That is why she was constantly in school or learning from her father's advisors. It wasn't the occupation she would have chosen, but she knew that it would break her father's heart if she declined to take over. Unlike most adolescents who would have run off and did what they wanted, she stayed. Paige had decided to become what her father wanted. Paige was continually in school, so she didn't really have time for herself or friends. Many times, her college courses would be interrupted. Paige was used to getting whisked away from school for threats on her or her father's life. It set back a lot of her free time, but she kept her head in the game and persevered. University of Houston. Paige Welsh sat quietly in her college class reading from a textbook. The pages sat lightly on her fingers as her eyes scanned the page. Her long blonde hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail. She reached up, adjusting her headband, breaking away from her book, and looking around the room at the other students. The class was fairly small, with only a few students. The professor sat at his desk thumbing through the newspaper. He had receding gray hair that was a mess, and his glasses sat on the end of his nose as he read. His blue button-down shirt was blotchy with coffee and food stains, while his khakis looked wrinkled and a bit holey. The man was brilliant but never really took care of himself. Paige watched as the professor coughed and reached for his coffee cup. Paige smiled and shook her head. She knew he was on his fourth cup of the day. Many times, he would ramble on and lose track of his lessons from the amount of caffeine. The windows to the small classroom sat open, allowing a calm breeze to blow gently through. The clouds rolled back, and the warm sunlight presented itself on her pale skin. A bird went chirping by and caught her attention, jerking her out of a daze. Paige turned her head, propping it on her hand. Her large green eyes fixed on the window looking outside at the nice fall day. Paige closed her book without breaking her stare outside. Paige balled her long black turtleneck in her hands and sighed as she watched the birds chirping in the trees and drifted into a daydream. She would much rather be outside exploring the city or country, doing what she wanted to do. Paige thought how it would be nice to just get up and walk out into the city and be someone else, do something different. Paige thought to herself maybe go down to the beach and lose herself in the waves. One of the boys sitting behind her had noticed Paige was daydreaming. He extended his foot and kicked her chair. Her seat made a small screech against the floor. Paige whipped her head around and noticed his black Converse still extended. His jet black hair was disheveled, as was the rest of his outfit. He looked very different from the prompt and proper clothes of Paige. A rock band t-shirt peeked out from under a half-zipped gray hoodie. His jeans were torn up a bit, and the chain that held his wallet clacked on the hard wooden chair. She reached around quickly and pulled off his shoe before he could kick her seat again. "Hey," he whispered as she held it. His blue eyes squinted at her as his nose wrinkled. Paige looked down and laughed at his pink socks. "Really, Xavier, I didn't know pink was your color," she teased as she held his shoe for ransom. "Oh, you know you like my socks." He pointed his toes close to her face, wiggling them. She squished up her face and held her nose. "Oh, no," she threw his shoe at him. "Hurry before you make everyone pass out," she said, holding her nose. Xavier laughed as he reached down to put his shoe back on. Suddenly, there was a gentle knock at the door. The professor choked on his coffee. He cursed to himself as he tried to wipe the stain from his shirt, but it was no use. It was another collection to the others. He set the cup down and quickly walked over to the door and answered it. No one else noticed this, but Paige. Everyone else was busy studying, and Xavier was putting his shoe back on. Paige tried to see who was at the door and what they were saying. The professor then turned and said, "Ms. Welsh," beckoning Paige to meet him by the door. She slowly rose from her seat and walked down the stairs. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she pulled down her turtleneck that was crawling up her back. "Yes, Professor?" she asked in a low tone, as trying not to disturb the others. When she finally reached the door, she noticed it was one of her bodyguards. "Ms. Welsh," James called. "Ms. Welsh, you need to gather your things and come with me immediately." Paige nodded and went back to her desk to gather her things. She gathered her books and put them in her backpack, then slung the bag over her shoulder. Xavier watched her. "What's going on?" he whispered with concern. Paige shrugged her shoulders as she fixed the straps. "I don't know," she answered him, trying not to let him see her concern. Paige waved to her friend as she walked down the stairs. The professor held the door open for her. She turned one last time towards Xavier. James placed a hand on her back. "Ms. Welsh," James said, his tone letting her know she needed to leave immediately. She followed the bodyguard down the empty hallway. "James, what is going on?" she asked, quickening her pace as he rushed her out. Not knowing what was going on was making her stomach twist. She gripped the straps of her book sack tightly and dug her nails into her palms. "Everything will be explained when we reach your home. I just need to get you out of here now." James explained to her as he opened the front door of the school. Paige slowly walked out, looking down at her feet. Her brown boots were tapping on the concrete as she walked swiftly towards the black car. Paige quickly buckled her seatbelt and watched James enter the car. She placed her yellow backpack on the floor and fixed the bottom of her jeans. The doors locked with a clicking sound. She was so focused on trying to figure out what was going on that the noise made her jump into reality. Paige looked up and noticed James was on edge. His dark skin glossy, as sweat started to form on his forehead. The car ride back to her home was silent. She sat in the back seat of the car, wondering what was wrong. It had to be something major for them to take her out of school. Other times they would just have stationed guards outside of the classroom. Paige reached up and started to play with her silver cross necklace. She stuck the chain in her mouth and started to chew on it while running the small cross across her cheek. As they rounded the corner, they noticed the huge crowd standing outside the mansion's gates. She sat up straight and dropped the necklace. Tons of reporters and cameramen started to swarm the car. Their voices carried, and there were so many of them that she couldn't make out what they were saying. The flashes from the cameras hurt her eyes, so she kept her head down. The pounding on the doors and windows started to echo in her ears, causing her to freak out. Paige removed her seatbelt and scooted to the edge of the leather seat. "James, what is going on?" she asked frantically, her hair becoming a mess as it fell from her ponytail holder from looking out of both windows. What was going on? She thought. So many horrible situations went through her mind. James honked the horn for them to open the gate. Other bodyguards and police held back the mob as James pulled in. As James pulled up in front of her home, she looked back at the tons of reporters and police. Something was horribly wrong. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Yeah, a reporter or two would show up at the mansion, but not a crowd like this. Before the car could come to a stop, she unlocked the door. She then wrenched the handle towards her and bolted out the car door. She didn't even bother to gather her things. She just ran inside her house. "Ms. Welsh." James put the car in park and took the keys out of the ignition. His large frame made it hard for him to exit as fast as she did. So, by the time he had gotten out of the car, she was already inside the house. Paige grabbed the large brass knob of the front door and flung it open, her heart pounding in her chest, as she raced closer towards an answer. She was in such a hurry, everything seems to be a blur. She even left the main door wide open and almost knocked over the butler, who came to investigate. The butler spun around and tried to catch his balance. James jogged into the house, bumping into the butler, knocking him down. He reached down and helped him up before running after Paige again. She entered the foyer screaming out for her father. "Dad. Dad, what's going on?" She looked frantically everywhere for him. Paige's heart pounded loudly. She could hear it in her ears. Her palms started to sweat as she ran through her house. Paige finally made her way into the den, where her father's advisors and main board members sat. A hush fell over the room as she entered. "Where is my father?" she asked, looking around, out of breath. She reached up and tucked her now loose blonde hair behind her ears. "Dad? Dad?" she screamed as she turned to go look upstairs. Her voice became raspy from the lump in her throat. She almost couldn't catch her breath. Mitch rose from the couch and walked towards her. Mitch put his hands on her shoulders, trying to calm her down. He turned her to face him, shaking her a bit out of the tantrum. He gazed into her eyes. Paige watched as his eyes watered, and she knew something dreadful happened. Her heart dropped into her stomach. "Paige, honey, I'm sorry, but your father," Mitch paused and cleared his throat. He's gone." Paige's face dropped. She knew what he meant, but she thought if she refused the truth it would change everything. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" she asked him. "He is fine. I talked to him this morning. He was going to take me to dinner," and Mitch snapped her out of her rambling and back to reality. "Paige." "No." He raised his voice, then paused to make sure she was listening. "Paige, your father has passed away." He then spoke softly, the words cutting like a knife through her. "No." She shook her head, trying to disprove him. No. She shouted even louder as she shook her head in disbelief. Her screams echoed throughout the house. Paige couldn't believe it. She didn't want to believe it. I'm so sorry, Paige, Mitch tried to comfort her. She pushed Mitch off of her and began to swat the air for him to stay away from her. Paige placed her hands on her head to try and stop the room from spinning. The tears she had held back began to fall. She plopped herself on the couch. Paige then buried her face in her hands and began to bawl. She cried so much she couldn't breathe. Her stomach twisted and ached from the bawling. She began to gasp for air. Tears stained her face and fell on the floor. Mitch didn't know what to do at first. He took a couple steps towards her, going to put his hand on her shoulder, but recoiled. He tried to hold back his own tears. It broke his heart even more seeing Paige like this. Mitch reached out his hand once more, but retracted it again, making a fist and placing it over his mouth. He finally sat beside her and patted her back, trying to comfort her. Mitch looked up at the others, signaling them to leave. They nodded and filed out of the room quickly as James waited for them to exit. He nodded to Mitch, seeing if he could handle it. Mitch nodded back and James closed the door. The small group gathered in the kitchen. They could still hear the cries of the young woman. Paige, honey, I'm so sorry, Mitch whispered as his own tears fell. Mitch was like family. He was John's best friend. Mitch had helped John start his company from nothing. They had known each other since their college days, so the news of John's death hurt him as much as it hurt Paige. Mitch placed his forehead against her head. He held her as she cried. A couple minutes passed, and Paige looked up. Her eyes were red and puffy, tears stained her face. What happened? She asked, trying to wipe away her tears, but as quickly as she tried to wipe them away, more would fall. Mitch rose from the couch and walked over to the small table. He grabbed a box of tissues. Police say someone stabbed him in his office. Mitch handed her a tissue. WHU. She stuttered, trying to clear her throat. She reached up and grabbed the tissue and began to wipe her eyes. Mitch sat the box of tissue beside her and began to pace the floor. His sadness now turned to anger. No one knows, but I have my suspicions. William? Paige asked. Mitch stopped pacing and turned to face her. William Green has wanted your father to merge with him for some time now. He paused, placing his hands on his hips. But I don't know, honey. Mitch looked down at her. He forced his own emotions back as he tried to calm her down. He needed to stay strong for her. William Green was the owner of a company that produces silicon, as well as banks for the cartel to wash their money, which is a vital product in the computer industry. His brother Joseph Green, a congressman, was the one who introduced William to the cartel. William wanted to merge with John Welsh for about 5 years now, but John turned him down many times. Even though it would have made John and his board members rich, he declined. The cartel offered to help William to benefit both parties. William was also of Italian descent, and it boiled his blood to be refused on his offers. John didn't trust William Green, so William gave the go-ahead for one of Marina's devils to take out John. John brought many jobs to the nation, and donated to several charities, while William only thought of himself. William was a greedy man and was also on the CIA and FBI's watch list for suspicious behavior with terrorism. He posed many threats to John if he didn't merge, but John didn't care. John kept to his ways, being an honest working American man. He didn't allow money and fame to change him like it did William. The two businessmen always butted heads because of this. William's recent branching out to the Ukraine Russians, who also worked with the Alvarez cartel, had him pushing the merger more desperately. Why don't you go up to your room? I will deal with the board members and the press. Mitch asked Paige. Paige nodded as she balled the tissues in her hand. She wiped her nose once more and rose slowly from the couch. Everything seemed to be in slow motion as she made her way up the stairs. Paige couldn't believe what had happened. Just this morning, her father had called her to wish her a good day at school. Now he was gone forever. Paige gripped the wood handrail as she made her way up the stairs. It squeaked under her skin as she let her hands slide up it. Paige looked down at her shoes, watching them move up the stairs slowly. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, so she watched her feet, each step a challenge. Paige reached her room and slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, and she stood there in the doorway. Her feet felt like cement bricks as she tried to make her way towards her bed. Everything she knew and had known was gone. This made her feel numb inside. Deep down inside, she knew Mr. Green was a stubborn and hateful man, but she never thought he would sink this low. Why her father? Paige finally reached her bed and fell on it, face first. She took a deep breath and inhaled the lavender scent of her sheets. All she could do was curl into the fetal position, so many thoughts flooding her mind, but the most asked question was, why? Why her? Why her father? Just why? She wanted to cry, but she was all out of tears. As she lay there, she stared at the wall in a daze. What is going to happen to me now? She thought. She wasn't ready to take over the company. She was scared to let everyone down, especially her father's wishes. Paige slowly closed her eyes, said a few prayers, and drifted to sleep. The following days were the hardest. Mitch handled the board meetings, the press, and the funeral arrangements. If it weren't for him, Paige didn't know what she would have done. Mitch kept it all together for her. He was a true friend in all this, the only steady thing in the tilt-a-whirl ride she was on. Adjusting without her father there would be very hard for her. She would constantly look at her phone, waiting for her father to call her like he had always done, a phone call just to see how her day was going. Now, silence, the blank screen, a reminder of the painful truth. Chapter 3. Many people had gathered for the funeral. Mr. Welsh was a very respected and loved man. Paige still couldn't believe he was dead. She sat in silence in the front pew of the church as the ceremony proceeded, her friend, Xavier, a couple pews behind her. The church was packed with people from all over, showing their respects. Many people had to stand because all the seats were taken. The grief in the air was thick and the room silent. Mitch walked to the podium to speak John Welsh's eulogy. Paige's eyes wandered through the crowd, and she noticed William Green sitting across the church. When she saw him, her blood started to boil. William sat with a couple of his own bodyguards and security. He had his black hair combed back, with a $1,000 suit on. He loved to show that he had money. His pink earring was even rumored to have cost more than a small island. Paige kept calm and collected on the outside, but on the inside a storm started to build up. Plots of revenge, among other things, ran through her mind. She knew it was Green. She could tell by his appearance at the funeral. His crooked smirk is what gave it away. Paige turned to face the front and began to play with her necklace. It was a small silver cross her father had given her. The cold, smooth metal gave her comfort. She would often play with it to calm her nerves. She remembered the day her father gave it to her. It was the eve of her 16th birthday, and Paige was standing in her room rummaging through her closet. She took a couple items out, laying them on her bed. It had been almost an hour and she still couldn't find anything to wear. Mr. Welsh was taking her out to celebrate, just the two of them. Paige looked at the items on her bed and sighed. As she grabbed the pink dress hanger, there was a knock on her door. "Come in," she said, walking back to her closet. She placed the dress back on the rack as her father entered her room. "Happy birthday, darling. About ready to go?" he asked. She turned to him. "No, I can't decide what to wear," she huffed in frustration. "It's all right, take your time." He laughed a bit. "You know you are just like your mother, right? She would be so proud of you. I know I am." He drummed his thumb over the little gray box. Paige looked up from her bed towards the noise. Pointing up towards his hand, she tilted her head. "What's that?" she asked, finally deciding on a green tank top with jeans. "It's your birthday present." He held out the box, walking towards her. Paige smiled and walked around her bed towards her father. Slowly taking the box from his hands, she smiled up at him, then down at the box. She slowly opened it to reveal a small simple cross. "It was your mother's cross," She had worn it every day. I asked her one day why, and she simply said to remind me that God is watching out for us, that He is always there for us, no matter what. No matter the problem or the struggle, this cross reminded her that He was there, helping. Paige smiled as she ran her finger over the cool silver. Thank you, Daddy. Mitch finished his speech and sat back down. He gave her a faint smile as he sat beside her. The pew creaked as he sat beside her. Paige again glanced back towards William. Mitch noticed her looking at him. He touched her knee. Don't worry about him, he whispered in her ear. The preacher asked everyone to stand as he prayed over the casket. The whole church stood up in unison. Everyone bowed their heads, except William. He just watched Paige from a distance. He touched one of his bodyguard's arms and whispered in his ear. The bodyguard nodded and left the church. Paige stared down at her black heels, thinking to herself. The preacher then called the pallbearers to come to the front and carry the casket out. The men did as they were asked, and Paige followed them out. She still eyed William as she passed by, her face full of anger and hate. William stared back at her, squinting his eyes and tilting his head. Before the last mound of dirt hit the ground, Paige plotted to bring William Green down. Paige thanked Mitch. Thank you, Mitch, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you. He hugged her. She broke from his embrace and headed towards the parking lot. Mitch stayed behind to make small talk with mourners. Paige walked off the concrete and onto the grass. The sun was peeking out through the clouds, lighting her way. She reached the curb where the car was parked. James got out of the car and opened the door for her. Before Paige entered, she paused only for a moment to glare at her enemy. William was surrounded by many people, but he could feel her glare on him. It didn't bother him one bit. Why would it? How could this little blonde girl scare me? He thought, and he laughed to himself. If he only knew what she had in store for him. Paige sat down and continued to stare at him as James closed the door. Weeks passed, and Paige used her money and resources to seek out information and the right people to help bring the man who was responsible to justice. At first, Paige wanted to kill William, but she knew better than that. She had asked her friend Xavier for help. Xavier was the only one that would help her. Everyone else laughed at her. Xavier didn't want her to do this, but he helped her anyway. He had a father who was in the military, and she thought he would know of anyone willing to get their hands dirty. They met down a dark alley outside of her college. Are you doing okay, Paige? Xavier asked her. Paige just watched him shift nervously in front of her. She reached out her hands. Xavier shook his head and placed his backpack on the ground. The humidity was thick enough to feel, floating around in the air, leaving a mist. The air started to grow thick and lightning flashed in the sky. It lit up the alleyway. Xavier handed her a file. He then placed the booksack back on his shoulder. My dad's friend, Nathaniel Steele, aka the Bull. He told her as she read the paper. Paige, just give this up and come back to school. Your dad wouldn't have wanted this. He tried hard to convince her. Paige ignored him as she read the file, her lips murmuring the words. Xavier looked around the alley to see if anyone was watching them. Nathaniel Steele was an orphan at a very young age. His parents both killed. His mother during childbirth and his father from a warehouse accident, and with no remaining relatives, he was always in and out of foster homes. Nate was a bit of a weird kid. He would also terrorize the neighborhood bullies. One time, Nate used his small Swiss Army knife to carve his initials into a bully's arm. When his foster father asked him why, he simply said so everyone would know that they were mine. This scared the foster parents and was the reason for his movement. At age 18, he decided to run away and make something of himself. Nate decided to join the Navy SEALs. SEAL training is extremely rigorous, having a reputation as some of the toughest in the world. Nate took this as a challenge. He graduated at the top of his class and soon squad. Killing came like second nature to him. No one cared for him, so he cared for no one. He was the strongest in the barracks. His determination and brute force intimidated everyone else. But his anger was his downfall, thus giving him the nickname, the Bull. His anger was the cause of this discharge as well. One of their missions went south, and a few men ended up dead or injured. The general decided to blame Nate, as well as get in Nate's face. The general screamed and cursed, so Nate cocked back and punched him right in the face. He wasn't one to be messed with. Didn't care who or what. He was dishonorably discharged from the military. But that didn't stop him from killing. He took up jobs to be a hired gun. A year after being discharged from the SEALs, Nate wandered around in Mexico City until he was found and joined the Seven Devils. Xavier had tried to talk her out of it again. Are you sure you really want to do this? This isn't like you. Whatever happened to the old Paige? He asked, clenching his hoodie closed. Paige looked up from the paper and replied coldly, I am no longer who I used to be, Xavier. I just want justice, and this man is the only person I can ask to bring it. He has no ties that I know of to Green, so he is my best bet. Paige then thanked him for his reference and walked away. Thunder clapped, and rain started to drizzle. Paige. Paige. Xavier called for her, but she ignored him. Another loud clap of thunder rang through the night sky, this time opening it to pour rain down upon him. He shook his head and ran towards the campus bookstore. He knew it was no use in trying to talk her out of it. Once her mind was made up, that was it. Paige stopped and turned, watched him run in the rain. He reached the bookstore and went in. I'm sorry, Xavier, she whispered to herself. She stuffed the file under her hoodie and covered her soaked hair. Paige then turned and walked slowly back to the taxi that waited for her. Paige didn't want anyone to know what she was up to. Sneaking out was easy, sneaking back in might be a little tricky. On the way back, she tried to think of a cover story. Chapter 4. Paige sat at a small table in the corner of a cafe. It was a rather small cafe, but fancy. Waiters with little black vests scampered about carrying trays. Fresh flowers on the tables with a small lit candle beside them looked quaint. The smell of bread and coffee lingered in the air as people laughed and talked to each other in low voices. The white tablecloth draped down on top of Paige's legs, and she reached down and pulled down her blue dress. Paige placed her elbows back on the table, only for them to stick to the plastic of the menu. She peeled herself off it and pushed the menu to the side. She wasn't there to eat. She was there to meet someone. Her once joyous free spirit was now dark and gloomy. Hate and pain weighed on her mind, and it showed in her face. It started to twist her into a whole different person, but she prayed it would not make her cold. She turned her head to watch outside the window as other people passed, wondering how it would be if she had another life, to be somebody else and have none of this happen. One of her hands propped under her chin and the other laid in her lap. God help me. She uttered a prayer to herself but was interrupted by a sudden bump at the table. She shook off her daydream and looked across the table. There sat a man. He was in his 40s with light copper-colored skin. He had a bit of scruff on his face, but not a full beard, more like a 5 o'clock shadow. Nate was solid and built like a rock. She could tell this was the guy. His eyes were covered by his sunglasses, but she could feel his cold stare on her. Paige wasn't sure if he was her hitman or not. He was way too attractive to be a hitman. The two studied each other for a moment. He finally broke the silence. So, who's the target? He asked in a low, deep voice. He sat motionless with his hands under the table. Paige caught a dark vibe from him. It was scary, but something about him she found attractive. Paige sat up and adjusted herself in her seat. I have two in mind, she answered him softly. Two? I was under the impression there was only one, he replied. Paige shook her foot under the table. She was so nervous. She never did this before, and the man sitting in front of her did not help. He sat motionless waiting for her to reply to this question. Yes, two. And I will be joining you, she spat out before she could catch herself. Paige could see his eyebrow rise from under his glasses. Then he cracked a sarcastic smile. You're joking, right? He asked. but her silence answered his question. He removed his sunglasses and laid them gently on the table. He took a deep breath before he spoke. His hazel eyes stared deep into her green eyes. Look, I'm a hitman, not a babysitter. You pay me to kill, I kill. I don't take partners or sightseers. His eyes still fixed upon her, she turned to look around the cafe, intimidated by him. I never said you had to babysit me. She turned her attention back to him. I just want to look into the eyes of my father's killer as I bring them in. I want him to beg me for his life as he is taken away to jail. I would do it myself, but I don't know how. I don't know where to start on gathering information, she said solemnly. He eyed her as he slowly picked up his sunglasses. Look, I don't have time for this. I only came as a favor to a friend. He rose from his seat, placing the glasses back on his face. She watched him walk away. She didn't know if she should find someone willing to help her or go after him. Paige reached up and gripped her necklace again. Her dad had always told her to follow her heart and trust her gut. Paige knew she didn't have any more time, so she went with her gut instinct and went after him. She grabbed her purse and quickly got up from the table. Her heels clicked as she tried to catch up with him. Rushing past people, she almost knocked down a waiter. The waiter spun around, almost spilling food on people. Paige would normally apologize, but she didn't have time. She eventually caught up with him in the waiting room. Nathaniel reached out to grab the door handle. Wait, Paige said, trying to catch her breath. Nathaniel paused, still holding the door slightly ajar. She came up behind him saying, my dad was all I had left, and that killer took that away from me. Paige looked down at the floor. Nathaniel let the door go. It closed slowly. He turned around and looked down at her. Paige went to speak, but his 6'5" height towered over her, intimidating her even more. You're young, you have your whole life in front of you. Ms. Welsh, you don't want to end up like me, I promise you that. Plus, I don't bring people in alive. He turned and walked out of the restaurant. She again went to follow him. She had a little trouble pushing the large door open. He killed my father in cold blood. I have nothing left. I'll I'll even triple your pay. Please. She pleaded, walking after him, her heels clicking on the concert. Nathaniel stopped walking, but his back still faced her. Paige grew tired of waiting for him to respond. She grew bold. Fine, I'll do it myself. She threw her hands in the air. Nathaniel smirked in admiration of the young girl's will. He turned to face her. Have you ever killed anyone before? He asked. No, and I'm not going to kill him. If you won't help me, what am I to do? She started to breathe heavy, thinking of what her next move would be. You can move on, settle down, run the business. And those kinds of men you can't bring in without a bullet to the head. He tried to talk her out of it. No, there's no settling. I want William Green in jail. She hissed from between her teeth. Either you help me and get your money, or I do it alone. She stared up at him. He began to think about it, although it'd be breaking all his rules. He broke his stare from her and looked around the crowds of the street. Nathaniel noticed the name William Green. The same name of the man he was sent here to help. Go home. He spoke coldly as he turned and walked away. Nate didn't want to tell this young woman this. She would just get in the middle of the cartel's business and probably end up dead. Fine, fine, she screamed as he walked away. Nate rounded the corner and looked back at Paige. He saw her still standing in the street, helpless and alone. Paige wiped her tears before they formed. She turned her head as her driver pulled up out the alley. She turned one last time to see if she could see Nathaniel, but he was long gone. Paige sighed and walked to the alley. James got out and opened the door for her. Are you all right, Ms. Welsh? He asked. Paige nodded and sat down, sliding in. Nathaniel leaned against the wall of the building and took out his phone. He laughed at himself. Do it myself. He laughed at the girl's words. He opened the messages and looked to see if anyone had texted him. Persistent, but he scrolled through the phone's contents to get his mind off of her. A bit dramatic. He laughed to himself. He had rules for a reason. Ever since he joined the Seven Devils, he stuck by those rules, and they kept him safe. His mind wandered back on that day when he was first asked to join that clan, and those were some of his darkest memories. He also thought back on Paige's words. She was going to get herself killed for sure. Why did he even care about some bratty rich girl? He sighed deeply. Paige wasn't as bratty as Marina, and she showed deep hurt and emotions. The Spanish devil called Marina didn't know what tears were. Nathaniel went to walk away when he noticed Derek walk towards Paige's car. Paige adjusted her dress as the door went to close. Unexpectedly, the door swung back open. Paige turned to see an unfamiliar man holding the door open. "Can I help you?" she asked, wrinkling her forehead, trying to figure out who this was. "Well, darlin'," he said in an Irish accent. He stepped in the car, scooting her over. The man cracked a smile as he removed his hat, putting it on his knee. His messy black hair fell to his face as his tiny frame sat beside her. It looked as if it hadn't been brushed in weeks. Paige frowned at his presence. He smelled of scotch and smoke. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to act brave, but the sound of her voice told different. "William Green, he wants a meeting, love." The man smirked. "Either you bring your little tight bum up to his office and sign over your company," or he scooted over towards her, "or I get to have a little fun." He reached out to touch her face. She pulled back and turned to exit out the other side of the car, but he reached over and closed the door. "Oh, I knew you would play hard to get. Where are you going?" "The fun is just starting." He grabbed her hand, pulling it towards him. "James." She yelled out for her bodyguard, but he lay dead outside. "Oh, hush, darlin', dear James checked out early. How about you give your dear Derek a kiss?" He laughed and made kissy sounds at her. She struggled to get free from his grasp. "Now calm down, it's all in good fun." Derek leaned in, smelling her neck and hair. Paige tried to push him off. She slapped his face and chest. It didn't faze him one bit, he just laughed at her. The driver door opened and in came a man. The man sat still, looking forward, motionless. "What the hell?" "Hey buddy, can't you see?" Derek stopped and let go of Paige. He squinted at the man who sat down. "Nathaniel?" he asked, recognizing who sat in front of him. Nathaniel buckled his seatbelt and started the car. "Derek," he said in a low tone without even looking at him. Nate's hand ran along the steering wheel and gripped it tight. The car was so quiet you could hear the leather underneath his hand squeak. "Marina sent you too, lad." He chuckled a bit, but his smile fell when he studied the bull's body language. "Driving us to the building, Derek let out a fake chuckle. Derek watched him intently while slowly reaching for his gun. Paige looked back and forth at Nathaniel and Derek. An air of anticipation filled the car. Paige wasn't sure what was going to happen next, and neither did Derek. He slowly sat up in the seat towards Nate. "Marina didn't send you to help the old man too, right? Then, what are you doing?" "Let's go," Derek asked, but Nate never answered. Derek watched Nate looking at Paige in the rear-view mirror, as Paige swallowed hard watching Derek. She was so terrified she couldn't move. She had been in bad situations, but none as crazy as this. This man was sent to bring her to William, and if she refused, to do unspeakable things to her. She closed her eyes for a second, trying to calm herself down. Now was not the time to panic. The very man she called to help her was working for William, or that is what she got from the situation. Derek quickly pulled his gun out on Nathaniel, but Nathaniel was faster. Nate wrapped his arm around Derek's arm. He gripped it tight, locking him. "Seatbelt," Nathaniel demanded, looking at Paige. Paige quickly grabbed the belt. She fumbled with it a bit, but finally managed to buckle it as he peeled out. Nathaniel put the pedal to the floor. Tires screeched as they spun, kicking up smoke and leaving black marks. The car finally took grip and sped off. Derek shot off a couple rounds, hitting the radio and AC vents. Nathaniel, with no hands on the wheel, only his knees steering, elbowed Derek multiple times in the face. As the men struggled, the car swerved all over the road. Paige gripped the handle and seatbelt, trying to figure out what in the heck was going on. Other cars on the road had to slam on their brakes to avoid hitting them. Horns echoed in the distance as the tires screeched down the road. Nathaniel hit him a couple more times, breaking his nose. Derek let go of the gun, cursed and held his nose. Blood stained his hands and the carpet. Paige noticed the red light and the heavy traffic ahead. She let out a faint scream and closed her eyes, not wanting to see what was going to happen. Nate reached a red light and slammed on the brakes. The car jolted to a halt. This caused the Irishman to fly into the front seat. Nathaniel put the car in park and reached over to open the passenger's door. He pushed Derek out on the curb. Nate then aimed his gun down and shot the man 3 times. Paige covered her ears as the shots echoed in the car. Derek's body lay limp in the street as Nathaniel wiped his fingerprints off the gun. He then threw his gun at the dying Irishman. Paige's mouth and eyes were wide open with shock. Paige blinked rapidly as Nathaniel put the car into drive and sped off. The terrified young woman turned to see a crowd of people rushing towards the man they left behind. She then turned to look at Nathaniel. Paige shook out of the daze she'd fallen into. Who she couldn't quite get the words out. He was a hitman. Nathaniel answered her question. Not a very good one, he's always drunk. Nathaniel just sealed his fate by killing his fellow devil. He knew Marina would come after him. Most likely herself, or send the others after him, but Nate was tired of working for these savages. It stopped today. So, you are taking me to William now. Is it? She hissed at him. No. He replied. Is that why you agreed to meet me? Huh. To bring me in first. She snapped back. Nathaniel glanced into the rearview mirror. I didn't know William Green is the one you wanted to kill, nor did I know he wanted you. I was just answering a favor for a friend. Now I am turning into a good Samaritan and a dead man. Paige didn't understand any of this, as questions flooded her mind. Chapter 5. What the he? William yelled over the phone. His face grew red with anger. The 2 men that sat in front of him did so in silence. Both Italians, one was short with greasy black hair, the other a bit taller and with short brown hair. They were too scared to ask what the matter was. William threw his cell phone, and it whizzed past the men's heads and hit the wall, startling the 2 thugs. Plastic rained down on the ground. The 2 men looked behind them at the broken phone, and then to William. Derek is dead, seems that little wench has help. He covered his mouth. He burst out in foul words and hit his desk with the palm of his hand. The 2 men jumped again. He continued to beat the desk, making his nameplate, along with other things, fall off. The 2 men reached out to catch them. The short one placed the nameplate back on the desk. Finally calmed down, William whipped his hair back. She will sign that company over to me, or William rolled his chair back from the desk. He rose from his chair and paced behind the men. The Russians need that program and those weapons by May. Do you understand me? I have 6 months. 6. Then they're going to expect delivery airheads. If I don't deliver, then not only will the Ukrainians rain down on me, but those dang devils. I thought they were supposed to be the best. He placed a hand on each of the guys' shoulders. He squeezed, hurting them. The 2 men clenched their teeth, trying not to make a sound. I know, boss. What do you want us to do? The tall one asked. I want you to go and get Vespa. He said, letting them go. They looked at each other with terror. Please, boss, no. The short one said. The boss smacked him upside the back of the head. Did I stutter? He yelled. The short one held his head in pain. She is the only devil that knows the importance of this merger. Her family is counting on it. No, sir. It's just, well, you know Vespa. The short one tried to explain his backtalk. The taller thug slapped him. Big baby, we will get it done, boss. The taller one said, looking at the shorter guy in disgust. You better. William said, walking back around to his desk. The two men got up and quickly made their way to the door. Oh, and tell Lisa, my secretary, I need a new phone, William told them. They nodded and opened the door. And Jason, William spoke to the short one. Don't wear so much cologne, eh? You smell like a cheap whore. He shook his head. The taller one laughed at Jason as he walked out. William could hear them cursing. Shut up, William stared at the closed door. Idiots, all of them. The car ride was silent as Nathaniel looked back at Paige. Her eyes met his in the rearview mirror every once in a while, with anger and confusion. He was trying to figure out what she was thinking. He sighed as he looked at the road ahead. Nathaniel couldn't believe he had helped this girl. She was more trouble than she was worth. Marina and Mr. Green would have him on his list as well for helping her. All those years of duty and respect Nathaniel threw away to save this one girl. He knew the man would not give up until Paige was dead. Nate knew men like him. Hell, he worked for them most of the time. How could he be so stupid for getting mixed up in all this? He gripped the steering wheel, hating himself. How could you be so stupid? He thought to himself and looked back at her again. Paige sat silently looking out the window, wondering where he was taking her. She didn't really care at this point. She was still shocked over the fact she was almost killed. She didn't know why, though. She should have seen it coming. William Green was a heartless man. He would stoop to low levels to get what he wanted, and now that her father was out of the way, she was his next target. Was she ready to take him on? She thought back on Nathaniel's words. She had never gone after anyone before, and had never been near death, either. Paige didn't know what to do or think. Everything was happening so fast. Her life was turned upside down and all she could do was watch it. Paige felt the car come to a stop. She turned to see Nathaniel put the car in park. She sat up in the seat, waiting for anything. What's wrong? She asked. He didn't answer her at first. He was the type of person that played out every word in his head before he spoke. Oftentimes, he didn't speak at all. She asked him again. You know, kid, I really don't know. He looked out both windows, making sure no one was around, always keeping his surroundings familiar. What do you mean? You drove me all the way out here. And God knows where, and you don't know. And I am not a kid. She spoke between gritted teeth, her emotions still very high. Nate sucked on his teeth, making a noise as he shook his head. Yeah, he said softly. Paige shook her head. Unbelievable. Just unbelievable. She dug in her purse and looked at her phone. Nathaniel turned around. I could have left you back there, you know. Let Derek kill you. So don't get smart with me, he said in anger. He grabbed her phone and tossed it out the window. A passing car smashed it to bits. Paige's mouth dropped a bit. She then closed it and looked back at him. Well, why didn't you? She snapped back. Heck, you didn't want to help me in the first place, so why didn't you? She asked even louder. 'Cause I couldn't see another innocent woman die. Plus, I owe a debt to my friend, and now I consider it paid. He snapped back. He turned in his seat to face her. He looked her up and down, almost sizing her up. This tiny thing was giving him lip. This is not the easiest kind of life, Ms. Welsh. You learn that quick. You kill or be killed. What I want to know is why you want to go down this path. Because you will have to kill him to get justice. These big wigs never go to jail, they get a slap on the wrist and a vacation. He yelled. I want revenge, she said. Revenge. Revenge is a child's response. He hit me, so I'm going to hit him back, he mocked. Paige made a face at this and snapped back. Child. Are you calling me a child? He killed my father. I want justice, she screamed, sitting up. So, your dad died. People die every day. Death is a part of life. You mourn and move on, he yelled without thinking. Nate couldn't finish his sentence before Paige got out the car. Nate whipped his head around and watched Paige walk off. Nate cursed out loud and hit the steering wheel before punching the ceiling of the car. Paige started to cry as she walked down the gravel shoulder of the highway. Cars whizzed past, blowing her messy hair. His words hurt her so bad. Who was he to tell her this? She stumbled over the gravel in her heels, almost tripping, tears running down her face like a monsoon. Nathaniel cursed at himself and got out of the car. He ran after her. Hey. Hey. He reached out and grabbed her arm. Paige whipped around. Let go of me. She slapped him away. You son of, she caught herself before cursing and screamed. She placed her hand over her mouth and cried. Nathaniel saw that he upset her. He wasn't used to being around people and didn't have much tact. Paige turned to walk away, and she fell hard on the gravel. She wiped the rocks off her hands, onto her tattered dress. Paige noticed her knee was bleeding a little and held it. Paige sat holding her skinned knee and cried. The emotions were too much for her to hold in anymore. Nate bent down to help her up, but she swatted him away. He went to help her again, and she slapped his hand away, again. Gritting his teeth as to not say anything else, he stood up straight and looked around. He felt bad, he did, but now was not the time for this. He got that the young woman just went through an ordeal, and most could not handle that kind of stress, but Nate was trained for these situations. Paige sat there for a couple minutes and cried. I have nothing left. William Green plans to take it all. He took my dad, he wants to take my dad's company and now my life. She screamed as she gripped the cross around her neck. What am I to do? Even if I could go back, I will die. She cried. Nathaniel looked up for a moment. She was right. She couldn't go back. Not now anyway. Neither could he. His back was a target just like hers. Look, I'm sorry. He paused, watching her. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't deal with many people, okay. Nathaniel thought to himself. Why was he worried about her? He usually didn't give a crap about other people, or their thoughts. So why was he standing like an idiot on the side of the road? We are in the same boat right now. Me helping you just now has got me in just as much trouble. I am sorry, Paige. I know this is a lot for you, but right now we need to move. He paused and noticed her finally listening to her. Don't give up just yet, he said, holding his hand out. Paige looked up at his hand. She wiped her tears away, and slowly reached up to his hands. He helped her up off the side of the road. Paige brushed the dirt off her butt and stood there for a moment. Nate sighed. He didn't know what to tell her. He didn't know this girl, or how to comfort anyone. When she was on her feet, he let her hand go and turned to walk back to the car. Paige swallowed and followed a few steps behind him. Nathaniel got in the driver's seat and waited for her to get in. Paige got in the back and calmed herself down. This path is blood cold and emotionless. Are you ready for that? He asked her. Paige didn't know what to say at first. Was he suggesting he was going to help her? Was he going to teach her to be a killer? She could not kill anyone. It wasn't right. He spoke again. On the outside, it seems so easy. Pull the trigger and end someone's life, but it's not. It stays with you, and no matter how many times you kill, it doesn't get any better. Yes, you become numb, and it does change you, but deep down it still gets to you. You learn to put up walls and not care for anyone or anything. I've been here too many times before, and your tears don't mean a thing. You want this so badly. Fine, I'll help you. Paige shook her head. I'm not a killer, nor do I want to be. She crossed her arms. That cross around your neck is not going to protect you. You need a gun and a will to kill. Nate glares as Paige glares back. God has helped me so far. I won't break any commandments. Paige spoke as she kept her eyes on her lap. Just remember, I told you so. He rolled his eyes as he turned and started the car. Paige wiped her face again as he merged back on the highway. He was right. If she was going to do this, she had to leave all emotions behind. The young woman needed to be strong and hard in herself. Everything she was, or once was, she had to leave behind. So, where are you going? She asked. We need to lay low for a while, let things settle down. I have a place out in the country. You will need to change your appearance also. And use cash, no credit. They can trace you that way. Paige listened to his words intently. When he was done speaking, he looked in the rear view at her. She nodded to let him know she understood. Not only was her life in danger, but his was too. It was only a matter of time before the other devils and Marina would find out about his betrayal. It was a stupid way to get out, but any way out this group would be in a body bag. At least this way he could at least help an innocent. One less innocent killed by the group.